Your book kind of runs Mercury, Venus, and Mars all together. I kind of like to take a more traditional approach and cover them in order: Mercury, then Venus, then Mars. So let's do Venus next. We've already talked about how Venus is always between the Earth and the Sun. It's an inferior planet. And so when you're looking at Venus, then you would see Venus on one side of the Sun or the other side of the Sun. So that would be an eastern or western elongation. And Galileo's work looking at Venus showed, in fact, Venus would go around the Sun rather than around the Earth. Venus has an orbital period of about 225 days, but because Earth is moving, after it's gone around one time, then Earth has moved. Really, Venus and Earth line up again about every 584 days. So that's the synodic period, 584 days. Now, the really interesting thing is the Mesoamerican calendar had a cycle of 584 days. The calendar was actually keyed to the planet Venus rather than to the Sun or the orbit of the Earth. And so that was very interesting. Venus actually being the brightest thing in the sky other than the Sun and the Moon. So it was very important to them in a very religious sort of fashion, and so their calendar was based on that. Venus is a very circular orbit. The eccentricity is one of the most round things in the solar system, so only 0.007. Albedo, though, is very high, 0.56. It reflects almost 60% of the light that hits it. It's nearly double what Earth does. And so because of that, Venus is always very bright. It's exceedingly bright. In fact, sometimes when Venus is fairly close to us and visible in the evening sky or the morning sky, either right after sunset or right before sunrise, it is actually sometimes bright enough that it will cast a shadow. In size, Venus is almost the same size as the Earth. It's about 95% of the Earth's diameter. It's like a twin planet to Earth. In fact, it's closest to Earth than any other planet in the solar system. So it's closest in size, and it's closest in mass, and closest in distance to the Sun. In fact, no other planet comes as close. Mars is nearly twice as far away from us as Venus. So Venus and Earth are like twin worlds. Venus can get much farther from the Sun than Mercury, so the greatest elongation is close to 47 degrees. So that means it can actually be up for 2 or 3 hours after sunset or rise 2 or 3 hours before sunrise. So that makes it a much more obvious planet to look at than Mercury. Mercury is often very hard to see because it's always very, very close to the Sun. In fact, many people have never seen Mercury because it's only at greatest elongation for a fairly short period of time, and you need to have good sky conditions and be able to see close to the horizon. Venus can be almost magnitude -5. Nothing else in the sky gets anything near that bright other than the Sun and the Moon. Venus is actually very frequently mistaken as a UFO. And so I've actually had people call the college and say, I need to report a UFO. Who do I talk to? And the operator referred them to me. And they said, well, I saw this UFO over Fort Worth. And I said, well, when did you see it? And where were you? And he said, well, I live in Bedford, and I saw it, and it was right after sunset. And I said, oh, you were Bedford, and you saw it over Fort Worth. That would have been Venus. And he goes, oh, it could have been Venus because I went in, ate supper, and came back out, and it'd flown off. I said, well, no, it's set. Okay. And so, in fact, back a number of decades ago, 1960s, there was actually, or maybe it was 50s, there was actually a fighter pilot that was on patrol and saw this really bright object and started chasing it, and he couldn't catch it. And he insisted that he was seeing light reflecting off of some object up above him, and he kept trying to chase it, and he couldn't catch it, and he had to return to base. Turns out later the Air Force found out that he'd been chasing the planet Venus. And so there's a variety of people who've seen Venus because it is so startlingly bright. Then they can't imagine it being a natural object, but it really is. Because Venus is always between us and the sun. It goes through these phases. It's smallest when it is, near full phase, and then as it gets closer, it'll crest and it gets very big. Now, a really interesting thing that sometimes happens is that when Venus is essentially new between the Earth and the Sun, you wouldn't expect to see anything, but you do sometimes see this very faint ring around it. That's called the Ashen Light, and that's really due to sunlight being bent around Venus by the atmosphere. And again, this is indicative that it has a very, very thick atmosphere. Venus does pass between the Earth and the Sun, and then here's some photos of Venus transiting the Sun. One on the left is from someone else. The one on the right is one that I took of Venus transiting the Sun. The transits come in pairs, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. The most recent transit was in 2012, in June 6th of 2012, and that was visible from the TCC campus, and we set up telescopes and looked. If you missed that, the next one is going to be in December of 2117, and then it'll happen again just a few years later in 2125. And so this is a standard pattern that you get a transit and another transit about 8 years later, and then over a century passes, and then you get another pair of them. So what's Venus like? Well, it's really hard to really say what Venus is like because we don't really get a good view of it, kind of like Mercury. Galileo saw phases, and so that helped him figure out where Venus, how it orbited the sun. By the 1970s, astronomers had noticed it had fuzzy edges to it, and so the fuzzy edges there indicated that Venus would be have a thick atmosphere. Antonati confirmed that, very thick atmosphere. And so at that point, they didn't really realize what was going on. But then 1930s, spectroscopic measurements detected carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then finally, by 1961, they had radar measurements of the surface of Venus. So we finally got what was going on. They realized there were clouds on Venus that we never could see through. And so we never could see the surface directly. And then it wasn't until 1962 that a spacecraft actually got there. Mariner 2, one of our first spacecraft launched by the United States in 1962, was an interplanetary spacecraft and flew across the solar system and flew past Venus. Did not go into orbit around it and had very, very crude instruments on board, but it did fly past Venus. Mariner 2 was the first one to fly by. 3 years later, Venera 1 was going towards Venus, a Soviet spacecraft, and quit working on the way. Venera 2 arrived and then flew past. Venera 4 actually arrived and entered the atmosphere. And then Venera 7 was equipped with a lander, so that actually landed on the surface of Venus. The lander did not have any ability to send back images or anything. That was just made measurements of the conditions there. Venera 9 in 1975 sent back the very first pictures of the surface. The United States wasn't done. There were other spacecraft that went to Venus, but in 1978, Pioneer Venus, one of the Pioneer probes, went to Venus and put spacecraft into orbit around Venus. And as it was orbiting Venus, it had radar altimeters that bounced signals off the surface and detected structures on the surface of Venus, and so gave us our first actual relief map of Venus, geographic relief map. 1989, Magellan spacecraft arrived with a different kind of radar imaging system, which gave us a much better measurement of Venus. And then finally, Venus Express, 2005, a European spacecraft went into orbit around Venus. So there have been a number, these are not all the spacecraft that have been to Venus, but these are a number of them, kind of key history makers that led to our first studies of the planet up close. Venera 1 was in fact the very first attempted mission, and that was in 1961. Mariner 2 was the first successful mission, 1962, so the American there. And then it was right after that, in fact, that President Kennedy made the announcement that we're going to be going to the moon. And he actually referenced the Mariner spacecraft to Venus, saying, mentioning it was way more successful than the Soviet one. The first one, Venera 3, first to enter the atmosphere, first to send back pictures, Venera, send back data from the surface inside the atmosphere, Venera 4, and then Venera 7, the first lander, and then the first pictures, Venera 9. In summary, we have a variety of Venus missions. The Soviet Union has sent 32 missions, 17 of them failed, but 32 missions to Venus. The United States has sent 10 missions, including some that just flew by on the way to other worlds. Japan sent 2 missions. One of them was a partial failure due to a solar storm. Europeans have sent a mission, and Bepi Colombo is actually scheduled to fly by twice. So you can count that as maybe the second mission. India and Russia are working on their own missions right now. Just as a little bit of trivia, I want to mention that during the mid to late 60s, as the Americans were developing the Apollo 5 capsule to go to Apollo 5 rocket and Apollo capsule to go towards the moon, they were actually considering the possibility of converting the third stage of a Saturn V into a habitat module, similar to what we did for Skylab, and sending that with an Apollo capsule attached to it to Venus, to loop around Venus and let Venus, come back to Earth, kind of a slingshot back to Earth, a 9-month mission. That idea was scrapped, and it's probably a good idea that it was, because they did not realize it at the time, but the radiation exposure to the astronauts would have been pretty close to lethal had they done that. But they didn't know that, but this was actually something that was considered, so I just thought I'd toss that out as a little bit of trivia